All right, so maybe for the sake of time, we should get started and folks will hopefully catch on as they sign in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this important panel. My name is Luisa Galveo. I work with Friends of the Earth US, and I'll be moderating this panel today about the World Bank's financing of fossil fuels. And I hope you don't mind. We're going to be recording today's panel. So before I pass it over to our amazing panelists that we have lined up, I'd just like to say a few words to set the context for our conversation. This week, the World Bank is holding its annual meetings. And this meeting is taking place just a few weeks before a historic climate conference, the 26th United Nations Conference of Parties on Climate, COP26, by which countries are due to finalize their national action plans to cut emissions under the Paris Agreement, among other actions to adapt and respond to climate change. With the COP a few weeks away, many questions remain around the timeline and details of how the World Bank will align its energy activities with the Paris Agreement, which it promised to do, along with other multilateral development banks more than 4 years ago. So ahead of this quickly approaching COP, the United Kingdom and another multilateral development bank, the European Investment Bank, are calling for more governments and institutions to join the phase out of fossil fuels. So the World Bank likes to say on repeat that they are the world's largest provider of climate finance to developing countries. However, the way that they account for this climate finance has raised concerns among civil society since it's nearly impossible to independently verify their numbers. They also don't account for the nature of this financing, and as we know, many countries can't afford more loans as they are already facing debt distress and limited fiscal space, and are owed a historical climate debt from the rich countries responsible for the lion's share of climate chaos, who also happen to be, I should mention, the major shareholders of the World Bank. So we don't deny that the World Bank is financing important renewable and adaptation projects, and we urge them to do more of this. But it's also important to point out that a lot of the good that the bank is doing on climate and energy is being undermined by its continued support for fossil fuels, which it doesn't count. We've made the analogy before that their approach is like throwing both water and gasoline at a house fire. And when taking stock of their action on climate, they're only counting the water, and non-transparently at that. They refuse to account for the harm to people and the cost to national economies that have come as a result of their support for entrenching fossil fuel dependency around the world. So here are the facts. The World Bank has provided 12 billion in direct project finance to fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. In 2020 alone, in the middle of COVID pandemic, when everyone was talking about the importance of a green and inclusive recovery to help countries build back better, the World Bank directed more than $1 billion to fossil fuel projects, more than any other multilateral development bank. And this doesn't include any support going through more indirect financing channels, such as financial intermediaries, which is just a fancy word for commercial banks and private equity firms that the bank supports, as well as that going through budget support, which is billions in non-earmarked money that the World Bank gives to governments to help them plug holes in their national budgets with policy reform conditions attached. So these represent massive loopholes to the fossil fuel financing restrictions that are currently in place at the bank, namely the restrictions against direct project financing of coal power plants and upstream oil and gas, which is exploration and drilling. The truth is that even though these restrictions have been in place for years, the bank continues to support coal and upstream oil and gas, but through backdoor channels. This happens through indirect channels like financial intermediaries, budget support, and the policy reform conditionalities they come with, technical assistance, associated infrastructure like transmission lines that evacuate power from coal plants, and more. In fact, a new study by Ergewald released yesterday by Heike Meinhardt lays out meticulously how World Bank assistance tied Pakistan to a coal-intensive development path without them ever having directly calling it coal financing. And it's important that we look beyond the numbers. The importance of the World Bank is not only because of their significant providers of direct project finance to developing countries, The importance of the World Bank is also because of the huge convening power they have and global knowledge networks they participate in, the technical assistance and the policy reform advice that they provide, the significant amount of private finance that they mobilize, the guarantees or risk insurance that they give to fossil fuel investments, and ultimately the signal that they send to investors. I think this is a telling quote. I found it on the World Bank website in regards to the Azito gas power plant in Côte d'Ivoire. The quote is from the technical director of this power plant in Côte d'Ivoire. Once the World Bank group is involved, investors feel confident. Another important point to make is that the World Bank is a public bank. It's founded by taxpayer money from around the world. Its mandate is to end poverty and to boost shared prosperity. The financing that it provides to countries is concessional. This means that it's given in better terms than the finance that countries can get in the regular market, like lower interest rates, longer payment periods, etc. Because of this, any finance that the World Bank is giving to fossil fuels is in fact a subsidy. And with this, the World Bank has helped to prolong the life of the fossil fuel industry around the world, instead of lead the opening of space for renewables industry. And while they like to talk a lot about energy access, data by partners like Recourse and the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation found that only 13% of energy-focused operations between 2017 and 2020 actually involved establishing new household connections to electricity. Again, that's only 13%, 1-3. And 2018 data from Oil Change International shows that only 2% of the World Bank's energy finance was for clean cooking from 2014 to 2017. So we always have to look beyond the bank's altruistic rhetoric. Furthermore, the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All initiative has determined that finance for fossil fuels as a means to provide energy access in developing countries should be terminated. And the United States' own energy agency has found that it is cheaper to meet unmet energy need through distributed renewables than to extend fossil fuel grids to rural areas where most unmet need is concentrated around the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. In June of this year, the World Bank released its new climate CCAP, which will guide the work of the bank on climate for the next 5 critical years. However, we broadly view the CCAP as a failure. The CCAP allows the World Bank to keep operating under business as usual until 2023 and 2025 for its private sector arms, MIGA and IFC, the dates by which they will finally be Paris aligned. It takes a selective and vague approach to phasing out fossil fuels and helping countries with a just transition, focusing only on coal without even giving enough details, and leaving the door open to oil and gas. It fails guidelines prior to releasing. It promotes false solutions like carbon capture and sequestration, as well as offsets, and it rolls out the red carpet to private finance rather than focusing on strong public responses. So the World Bank is really dragging its feet and needs to be pushed. But don't take it from me. That's enough from me. Let's hear from our distinguished panelists in countries directly impacted by the World Bank's activities. So today we'll be hearing from Melinda Jenke about the World Bank's unlawful actions in Guyana. We'll be hearing from Katrina Lehman Group about the World Bank energy investment in South Africa and recommendations for a just transition. We'll be hearing from Daniel Ribeiro on the impacts of World Bank investments in gas in Mozambique. We'll be hearing from Anne Songole on recommendations for World Bank energy investments in Africa. And we'll be hearing from Uta Kozi on the World Bank's Global Day of Action, what is planned and how to get involved. So without further ado, we'll start with Melinda Jenke. And Melinda has asked that we start her presentation with a short 2-minute video. So if you'll bear with me for just 1 second. Oops, sorry, got started a little too early. I'm gonna share my screen and share that video with all of you. Oh, I think the screen sharing is, I'm not enabled for screen sharing. For our tech helpers, can you please enable my screen sharing?
It should be good now, Louisa, if you try again, or it might take a second to kick in.
Oh, I think I see the arrow now. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. All right. Hopefully you can all see this, and I'll get it started now.
Climbing that mountain, getting to the top. I'm taking my time, but I ain't gonna stop singing. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. The tide is getting high, but I ain't gonna drown. I fall right to the top if you try to hold me down, singing. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. You can push me down, but I get up again. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop, I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop singing. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop, I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop singing. I got my eye on the prize and the prize on my mind. Money ain't a thing, but don't mind another time singing. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. You can push me down, but I get up again. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop, I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop singing. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop, I ain't gonna stop, ain't gonna stop singing. You can push me down. You can push.
Hopefully you were all able to see and hear that. And it's a powerful opening for Melinda. And thank you, Sophie, for sharing the link in the chat. So Melinda, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this wonderful panel. The recent IPCC report confirms that the Earth is getting hotter. The climate system is breaking down, its level is rising, the ocean is getting hotter and more acid. The Secretary General of the United Nations says that the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions are choking our planet and putting billions of people in danger. We're in a climate emergency. Fossil fuel companies know that they're killing the Earth, but they don't care. In contrast, Guyana is helping the world to live. Guyana's forests take out more greenhouse gases than the Guyanese people emit. Guyana is a carbon sink. In today's climate, literally and figuratively, Guyana's removal of greenhouse gas is worth billions of dollars. What price do you put on the survival of life on Earth, on your life or your children's lives? The World Bank is on the side of fossil fuels and destruction and lending Guyana millions of dollars to do oil and gas, to transform Guyana from a carbon sink to a carbon bomb. 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas that will help to destroy life on Earth. Guyana committed under the Paris Agreement to go 100% renewable energy if Guyana gets the financing. The World Bank is helping Guyana to go from heavy fuel oil to gas, not renewable energy. The World Bank knows gas can't work. A World Bank study says there's little or no domestic market for gas in Guyana. The gas is coming from Exxon's operations. Exxon is supposed to re-inject that gas, but they're flaring it, illegally, in my opinion. Is that why the World Bank wants Guyana to be burdened with gas? The World Bank promises to reduce poverty. Gas infrastructure will cost the Guyanese people billions of dollars. Thanks to the World Bank, Guyana's people will get expensive, dangerous gas instead of cheap, safe, renewable energy. Gas will actually make Guyana poorer. Exxon has flared more than 15 billion cubic feet of gas. Very bad for the climate, very bad for the ocean. Guyanese people want Exxon to stop flaring. The World Bank wants Guyana to join the World Bank Zero Flaring Initiative, which would actually let Exxon flare until 2030. Flaring is illegal under Guyana's laws. You saw the TikTok clip made by a brilliant young Indigenous woman in Guyana. The World Bank project hired lawyers to change Guyana's laws. Our friends in Urgewald exposed these lawyers as ExxonMobil's lawyers. Worse yet, the lawyers boasted of their connection to the World Bank. Guyanese citizens asked David Malpass to disclose the relationship between the World Bank staff and Exxon. Mr. Malpass did not reply, but Guyana's press later said the lawyers had withdrawn from the project. Guyana's oil deal with ExxonMobil is so exploitative, even the IMF criticized it. Yet the World Bank is pushing Guyana to let ExxonMobil take this oil. Oil and gas are rapidly becoming stranded assets. The IMF is telling countries to get their economies away from oil and gas in order to avoid economic collapse. The World Bank is telling Guyana to destroy its economy by turning to oil and gas. The World Bank claims that its Guyana project will improve governance, but the bank's project is itself unlawful. In 2019, the Guyana government had fallen. There were no ministers. The World Bank country director signed the Guyana financing agreement with an individual who was no longer a minister, thereby violating Guyana's constitution. Violating Guyana's constitution, undermining the rule of law and democracy, conflict of interest, secrecy, support for oil and gas, breaching the Paris Agreement and international law. That's the World Bank in Guyana. We sent the evidence to David Malpass and the executive directors. World Bank staff can't answer a single question or justify their actions. Today, I say to the World Bank, stop supporting oil and gas, stop violating the Paris Agreement, stop supporting ExxonMobil at the expense of the Guyanese government, at the expense of the Guyanese people. To you, the audience, I say, join us. Let's stand together and stop the World Bank from inflicting more harm on our Mother Earth and our people. And to my fellow Guyanese, I say, don't be fooled by the World Bank and their false promises. Remember the words of the great Robert Nesta Marley when he urged us, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Let's stand together and protect our country and our planet from the killing effects of oil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melinda, for that powerful, for those powerful remarks. And next, we'll pass it to Katrina. Katrina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Louisa and Melinda, for sharing your story from Guyana. And hello to everybody who's attending. My name is Katrina Lehman-Gruber, and I'm a climate justice researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. And I'm really pleased to be here today on this amazing panel to talk a little bit about South Africa's experience with the World Bank's funding in the energy sector. Now, in order to provide an analysis of its current role in climate finance, fossil fuels, or even in renewable energy, it's useful to think back a little bit, as well as a little more broadly, to the role that the World Bank has played in South Africa and in other countries in the global south over the past 50 years or so. So despite its role as a development finance institution, many of the impacts of the World Bank's funding have resulted in quite the opposite. The World Bank had supported the apartheid government in South Africa, and it imposed structural adjustment programs across the continent, which saw calamitous effects on its people. It has used its role to alter the macroeconomic framework in which we operate, promoting the privatization of industries, the gutting of government spending, and the financialization of development. This has occurred in the energy sector specifically, with the push for cost recovery tariffs and structural reforms, such as unbundling of state-owned utilities to enable privatization of electricity generation. This kind of ideology has seen the consequences of its actions with the plight of COVID-19, with neoliberal policies creating the foundation for the disastrous social and economic impacts of the pandemic. The importance of this in relation to how we face the climate crisis cannot be overstated. COVID-19 has starkly illustrated what crises do and what kinds of responses we need from governments. And yet, it has also substantially shrunk the economic space available to many countries due to interruptions in supply chains, increasing debt, forcing them to outsource, privatize, and reduce social spending. This will ultimately leave the world less just than it already is. And yet, the climate crisis, like other crises, can also be used as a cover for new forms of structural adjustment. Because under the guise of the urgency of shifting to a low carbon economy and energy system, an even less just order may be instituted. And this is something that is already being witnessed in the South African electricity system. Arguably, the World Bank's most famous, or rather infamous, involvement in South Africa in the past 15 years was its credit facility, which financed the building of the Medupi coal-fired power plant. As the biggest in South Africa and one of the biggest in the world, Medupi is contributing astronomical levels of carbon dioxide and highly toxic sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. This is despite the fact that part of the project's aim was to support South Africa's long-term carbon mitigation strategy. This project, which was approved in 2010 and only has just come online, was met with massive protest from South African civil society. Petitions were submitted, numerous letters and articles were written, protests were held, and a complaint was filed with the bank's inspection panel. Now, 2010 was not too long ago, and the dangers of climate change were well known then. The World Bank itself released a report that year stating that unmitigated climate change is incompatible with sustainable development. And yet, that didn't stop them from financing one of the biggest coal-fired power plants in the world, notwithstanding the allegations of corruption, the massive environmental destruction it would cause, and the widespread protest from affected peoples. This all contributes to the need to recognize this debt as illegitimate and odious. And now here we are, 11 years later, and we are supposed to believe that the World Bank has fundamentally changed its ways. The 2021 to 2025 Climate Change Action Plan is supposed to support green, resilient, and inclusive development. In the energy sector, its stated priorities are helping countries with power sector planning, energy subsidy reforms, and improvements to the operational and financial performance of utilities, amongst others. The document takes a firm stance that it will significantly increase its programmatic support for the transition away from coal in climate countries, and recognizes that the economics, construction, and operations times and emissions of coal power plants cannot be reconciled with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Our memories are not so short in South Africa. We see the irony in this statement and what would appear to be the desire of the World Bank to have its bread buttered on both sides. South Africa may well be one of the first countries in which some of this new plan is tested out. There are numerous reports that the World Bank may be financing parts of Eskom's Just Energy Transition Plan, with some sources saying that the World Bank has already approved funding for batteries and the closing and repurposing of 4 coal-fired power plants. However, the amount of financing, the types of financing vehicles used, what exactly will be financed has yet to be disclosed, let alone been made available for participation and consultation to the people of South Africa. Nonetheless, based on the brief history I outlined, we are not hopeful that this financing will provide the resources South Africa requires to transition in a just manner, nor allow for the structures and governance mechanisms necessary to achieve it. Existing evidence suggests that the World Bank's support for wind and solar operates through mechanisms which financialize the electricity sector while prioritizing and securing benefits for private players over workers and communities. There's a risk that an untransparent agreement will simply create markets for other countries' technologies and companies, hollowing prospects of building local manufacturing, which is one of our main hopes for garnering decent work opportunities. A just transition in South Africa needs to take seriously the needs of those most affected by the transition and by climate change itself. It should be based on justice principles, including distributive, procedural, and restorative justice measures, which hold profiteers accountable and ensure that benefits are distributed to those least responsible. In order to achieve this, a just transition must be based on the principles of public ownership and dedicated funds paid for by the highest emitters. It will require diverse measures such as industrial policy for renewable energy manufacturing, job guarantee schemes, universal social protection, land reform policies which ensure land is redistributed, and wealth taxes to address the excessive and criminal inequality that continues unabated in South Africa. Now, much of this work relies on the South African government and other governments faced with similar challenges. However, there is a role for the World Bank. The most important thing it can do is to cancel the odious, illegitimate, and unsustainable debt contributing to Eskom's suffocation, increase the availability of grant financing not tied to conditions of structural adjustment, provide dedicated funding towards real interventions for the just transition, such as job guarantee schemes, and encouraging and assisting with public investment in renewables, rather than the privatization of energy systems worldwide. In order to do this, the World Bank must release countries from its ideological grasp and allow them to follow democratic participatory processes to manage a just transition with an understanding of our contexts and requirements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina, for your remarks. And next, we're going to go not far from South Africa, just next door to Mozambique. We'll hear from Daniel Ribeiro about the World Bank's role in Mozambique.
Hello, can people hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Cool. Is it possible to have share screen?
Yeah, I'll add you now.
Thanks. Okay. Hi, so I'll just quickly, hi everyone, I'm sorry for the delay. I'll just give a quick run through on the history of the World Bank, not the history, but some of the past actions of the World Bank, because it gives a good context what's happening right now in Mozambique and how they've managed to do this while still claiming that the funding has been for green, carbon neutral, climate friendly funding. One of these areas has been in the World Bank development policy finance. A lot of this has been classified as green, carbon neutral, climate friendly. But if one looks at Mozambique, a lot of this funding went to policies and energy, like the energy strategy Mozambique, the oil, petroleum and gas and hydrocarbons regulations, laws and policies. And all of these create a foundation for the growth of the fossil industry in Mozambique, because we didn't have coal, gas in Mozambique until, and it's a lot of these sectors have come in the last decade or so. So this has been highly supported by, and the foundation for this has been linked to the World Bank. Meanwhile, they have not focused and not supported the renewable sectors. The energy strategy, actually, the World Bank and its experts highlighted that coal, gas was the best way for Mozambique to develop its energy needs. It undermined some of the environmental governance. Our EIA was renewed and weakened with timelines to facilitate investors with needs, and also other links to forests, deforestation and land rights that will be covered. And all of this work that created all the foundations from regulation policies and all the needed bureaucratic foundation was done while claiming and registered under its climate-friendly financing. At the bottom, it shows you some of these projects, including public partnerships and there's a lot. We only have 10 minutes, but we have some research, and I can make those links if people want to read more details. And as a result, Mozambique has fully focused its development on extractives. This is a map from the interactive mining mining concessions. It's available online, and you can press on any of these concessions and gives you the owner and the resource that's been extracted. So a lot of investment, and it's very formalized, very easy for investors to come in. And as you can see, if all these projects go ahead, we're going to have major problems, because around almost 70% of the population is subsistence fisher folks or small-scale farmers. And therefore, land is the main form of livelihoods. In the north, in some provinces, it's over 80%. So this is causing huge land grabs and putting livelihoods of the majority of Mozambicans at risk. And this scenario we're seeing now was created with the support of the World Bank. The other area that we have to realize is the way World Bank uses poverty to push its fossil fuels. There's a lot, if one reads the documentation around World Bank, we notice a lot of this energy access and the importance of energy poverty and dealing with these things. Mozambique needs to deal with its energy access. The numbers right now for rural areas is 26% have access, but this is misleading, because the way Mozambique defines access is if you're near the network and you have the option of connecting, you have access. If you don't have the money, that's not their problem. So these numbers are actually much more misleading, but as you can see on this is a bit outdated, but still it's still close to the reality. We have a lot of areas which have 10 to 15% access. So poverty is used, but there's weak targets. There's no tracking to verify if what these claims to help poverty are actually being met. There is no guidance on how to ensure that projects focus on access over export. So what happens is projects, the whole capacity is seen as contribution to access, but most of the time, most of these projects actually only focus on exports. But they go into the statistics as a project for access, and there's no real monitoring or data that's easy to follow to highlight these issues. But when you dig deeper, you realize, and if you're on the ground, you can see the reality. There's also very little focus on reducing or phasing out fossil fuels. Mozambique is starting its fossil fuel development in the midst of the climate reality, and with everybody saying we have to phase out, we're starting. And the World Bank is a big part and help in making this happen. And they do it in quite diverse ways, as mentioned before, and it's something that is a big concern. And even though a lot of these policies were done a while ago, we're seeing the reality now. A lot of these policies were done in the last decade, but they are now becoming reality. The other thing we have to also realize is the World Bank is supporting a lot of false solutions, carbon offsetting and RED projects. Why is this important? Well, it's impossible for these fossil fuels projects to get approval and move forward if they can't have an answer to how are they dealing with their emissions. And the only way they can do this is if they can offset it or do projects like RED. So RED is reduced emissions to decrease deforestation, meaning that if they claim to protect a certain forest, that forest and the projected loss of that forest due to deforestation goes to offsets. And this allows them to claim these carbon credits to claim that they're carbon neutral. And without this, it becomes very hard for them to justify to certain types of investors. The problem is a lot of these projects are being identified in Mozambique in community areas. So it's causing, and the few pilot studies that had gone ahead have put a lot of issues around community land rights and community access to their resources. So it's putting a wave. So you have the land grab from the mining, but then you have the land grab from the forest offsetting initiatives that also take community land. So you have a double whammy, and you facilitating the ability for these projects to move ahead. But of course, Mozambique's land law has to be weakened to facilitate even further. So you see support of reforms and other investments to create easier conditions around land access to facilitate the land grab. And then you have this whole trend that you need the notion that and this ability of World Bank of creating narratives that become reality in the mentality of political leaderships. And one of them is that you need to sell it to save it, meaning that there is nothing will happen if there's not a dollar sign, that you need to commodify nature, financialize everything if you have any chance of doing anything with it. So if you don't put in markets, it has no value and has no way of contributing to your development. And our government has been heavily influenced and has taken this narrative fully, and that's a big concern. So there's some more data there, but I can give you that in links if people are interested. The other area is the World Bank ability to debottleneck fossil fuel investments. If one looks at Mozambique, and this is where the gas comes in. If one looks at Mozambique, it's one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. We have huge infrastructure problems. We have social instability. We have insurgents up north and conflict. We've had conflict between. We came out of a civil war in the early 90s, and we still have a lot of a quite tense relationship between the two big parties. And there's lots of risks. And it's very unlikely that companies and investors come into a country like that without some kind of insurance, some kind of guarantees. And the World Bank plays that role very effectively. The World Bank creates and compensates for these risks and allows investors to come in, otherwise they wouldn't be due to the risks. Through guarantees, through insurances and many other schemes. And that is critical for these projects to go. Another thing is, due to the lack of infrastructure, there's a lot of bottlenecks and difficulty to get your resource out. So what World Bank does is they invest in infrastructure such as railways, electrical lines, and other type of projects which are part of poverty, like energy access or other forms of development. But when you look at where they're made to get resources out. And again, hiding behind poverty, but also making these investments feasible. And therefore they strongly link to these fossil fuel projects, even though it's not registered as supporting fossil fuel, registered as development. Again, hiding the role they've played in allowing gas and coal in Mozambique to develop. Another thing they've done a lot in Mozambique is play with speculation, inflation, and projections of the value of coal and gas in Mozambique's development. Especially in the 2010, 13, 14, and even before that, it was the model that the World Bank really pushed for Mozambique and really influenced the way Mozambique government and other partners investors saw the way forward to Mozambique was through gas and coal, and the projections that the World Bank played with, and the possible revenues, and all these things that were super inflated, hyper speculated, and was mentioned by experts even then. And it's been now shown to be correct that they were completely overestimating and making a much rosier picture. And given that the markets the world markets are 80% derivatives, speculation has a huge role, especially such a big institution like the World Bank. And then, of course, as I mentioned before already, the support of that they have in funding policies, laws, and regulations that facilitate the conditions to allow easy entrance of investors in these sectors. So basically, I only have 10 minutes. The World Bank has created one of the foundations. Has been one of the big play in creating the foundations for Mozambique, and that's why we see such an influx of so many funders coming to the gas, even with all these risks, all these dangers, the foundation was a really strong foundation was created by the World Bank to allow the investment to come into Mozambique in the way it's coming, given all the risks, or given all the infrastructure bottlenecks, given all the issues and problems around Mozambique, that create a good foundation to compensate for this and has allowed the reality we see today, which is a rampant growth of gas and coal in Mozambique, and it's not going to stop. I can answer more questions. Thank you very much for giving us the time to speak about this issue. And any questions, I'm available. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for those really detailed, for that really detailed case study of the role of the World Bank. Next, we'll pass it to Anne. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Louisa. It's such an honor to sit among all these great panelists. And I'll just begin by thanking you, Big Shift, for having Access Coalition on this panel. I also extend, hearty regards to my fellow panelists. Coming after Daniel is really important for us because access exists to advocate for the energy poor to have access to safe, affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. And this is part of the work that we do with the CSOs. So my name is Anne Songole, the Advocacy and Communications Manager at Access Coalition, and I will be sharing some of the key recommendations in regard to World Bank Group's energy financing in Africa. So first and foremost, I really want to draw your attention to the World Bank Energy Strategy. We were really excited because the strategy was supposed to be out last year. And I think part of this year was the consultations stage. We felt that the strategy would really offer a solution to Africa's energy challenges, but unfortunately we learned the other day that, this was not the case, as there was not going to be a strategy. Instead, the bank opted to develop what they call guiding principles for investing in Africa. And we do welcome this, particularly if the principles will accelerate energy access and adjust an inclusive energy transition in Africa, as we're in the last decade for achieving SDG 7. And so just to give a little more context, I'll talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, which has very unique energy challenges. So first of all, there's the dominance of fossil fuels, just as Daniel mentioned earlier. Climate change is pushing, the poor and the marginalized in Africa further into poverty. And, if we do continue production and consumption of fossil fuels, will intensify these impacts, especially to those marginalized. And, in Africa, the top 20 access deficit countries are found here. And these account for about 82% of the global population without access to energy. And in Africa, once more, 70% of households are unelectrified. I think I should mention that this is in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we still remain, the continent is home to abundant renewable energy resources. We've had it before. And additionally, there's a lot of renewable energy power potential, which is larger than the current and projected power consumption of the continent, which is a good thing. So if the growing demand for the electricity in middle and low income countries is met using polluting energy sources, we're never going to meet the Paris agreement. Just going back to the investment that has come to Africa, we are talking about $5.6 billion to renewable energy, against the world's average of $337 billion. So this is really not enough, even as we talk about what the bank is doing. Then in Africa, we have unreliable grid connectivity. And just to give more context, 2/3 of African grids are considered unreliable. And there are so many enterprises that experience an average of at least 10% downtime and 8% revenue losses. A consequence of this is that there are 7 million backup gensets, and this amount to about 120 coal power stations. That's not good. That's really taking us back. And we still have an underdeveloped clean cooking sector. We know that the bank has realized the importance of clean cooking. They have an energy compact, but still we are still at the place where Africa, 82% being done, dealt with also. And 600,000 Africans are dying annually from household air pollution due to inefficient cooking, making this the second largest health risk on the continent. So based on this, what do we recommend to the bank during these important civil society forums? We want the bank to disclose the guiding principles for investing and financing energy in Africa. So what this will do is that it will give stakeholders an understanding of what is being prioritized. And it will also enable now the governments and private sector CSOs and other stakeholders to engage effectively during the bank's planning processes at the country level, for instance, through country partnership frameworks. Going back to what Daniel just mentioned about Mozambique, it was important that he mentioned that governments are really influenced by the banks. And so we do need intermediaries to come in with data and information that will further influence this organization, the governments, and they will influence the way they engage with the banks. And so the second out of another 4 more recommendations that we have is we really want the investment in off-grid decentralized renewable energy to be increased, to be prioritized, and the phasing out of fossil fuels as well. So we know that most people without electricity live in rural areas, in remote areas, where the grid cannot reach. And so what's the cheapest way to provide access? It's usually by using these least cost options through this decentralized or distributed energy systems. Our third recommendation to the bank is for them to prioritize inclusive and integrated planning for the energy sector. So here, what we're talking about is we want energy to be considered, to be mainstreamed, to be considered into wider energy plans and service delivery. And this will enable it to respond to wider context of sustainable development and human needs. So we do need a needs-based approach to energy planning, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in countries with high energy poverty. Our fourth recommendation is for the bank to ensure the participation of CSOs and energy poor communities and groups in the development of country partnership frameworks and even in their projects. So we must note that CSOs have decades of experience working with local communities, and we know what's working and what's not working on the ground. And we have valuable data just by these interactions, and we can advise on policy and implementation frameworks. Just to mention, we can also unlock what is happening in an attempt to influence governments to take on investments that make sense within context. And finally, our last recommendation is for the bank to address energy affordability, and this should be by prioritizing demand-side subsidies that will enable poor communities afford energy. Last mile communities are never, market ready, and we have seen a lot of market-based approaches. And we're calling on the bank to think about demand-side subsidies that will make these last mile communities afford energy. And we also want the bank to take special interest in the clean cooking sector. So thank you once more for this wonderful opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for those really helpful recommendations. And I think this is a fitting moment now in our panel. We've heard from the panelists on the impact of past World Bank actions, current World Bank actions and processes that groups want to be better engaged around. We've heard recommendations. And next, we'll hear from Ute on actions that we can take to push the World Bank to do better on all of these areas that our great panelists have spoken about. So Ute, over to you.
Thank you, Luisa. Thanks for all the panelists who have given us a very strong picture of what's happening in the world. And that's the reason why we decided already several years ago that we need more pressure. This webinar helps us, or helped us to understand why we need a global protest against the World Bank and their politics. And my name is Ute Kotschi. I'm with Urgewald, based in Germany. And my job now is to introduce tomorrow and Friday. So it starts on October 14th to Friday 15th from noon to noon in your time zone. Why is this? It's because the World Bank is still driving billions into fossil fuel investments. They are locking countries in, and they don't do what they promised to help people, to help countries to come out of poverty. Since the Paris Climate Agreement, and that's, you can start with 2016 until 2020, the support for fossil fuel investment has continued, and that's a wrong step from the World Bank. And we also think, and that these are all the groups who are involved, that letters or nice politics ways do not help. We need public pressure. And that's why we decided already 2019 to have a demonstration in front of the building in Washington. That's why we decided that we need a first virtual World Bank Action Day 2020. And we know we need the next World Bank Action Day during this year and tomorrow and Friday. It's because the World Bank, the governments and the executive directors, they don't believe our numbers, or they think they don't need to listen to us. And they don't need to listen to us because they have politicians in there backing them so that they can continue like they want. We have heard the examples from Guyana, South Africa, Africa, Mozambique, and it's really convincing. The World Bank is failing its own policies. And they are doing this with different instruments. And it's not only done through direct investments, even though you can say there is still project finance, and Luisa was giving us already the numbers. But they are doing this also with fossil fuel enabling infrastructure, like transmission lines for new coal power plants. They're doing it with policy reforms, tariffs, and lower taxes. And Daniel was giving us the examples in Mozambique, how they're doing it with the new petroleum tax. They are doing the fossil fuel investments also through technical assistance and pushing forward fossil fuel investments. And it's done indirectly. You don't see it. They can lie to the public and say, oh, we are not doing this, but they are doing it indirectly also because they have unrestricted government budget support and nobody can really follow where the money is going. And they pass money on into fossil fuel investments through intermediary banks and equity funds. All this gives the picture that there are parts of the management and also with the president, David Malpass, they are continuously promoting fossil fuels. And that's the reason why we have the World Bank Action Day. And there are three parts. One part is the action you do wherever you want, in front of a World Bank office, in your country, in your place, in your room. You hold up signs saying, stop World Bank, get out of fossil fuels. But we also created a letter to the governments and to the executive directors. We're telling them that they should fire Malpass and parts of the management because they are not following the demands from the Paris Agreement. And we give you a press release where you can tell your country, your community that the World Bank is still following the wrong paths. So if you check our webpage, and it's the World Bank Action Day org webpage, you can find information, you get the background, you have the actions, you have the toolkit, and you can call upon us with everything else what you want to know. And yes, tomorrow we hope that you can join and that you promote the World Bank Action Day through Twitter. If you say World Bank get out of fossils, World Bank stop driving billions into fossil investments, World Bank Action Day, and World Bank. The letter still can be signed, and you will find it also on the webpage, worldbankactionday.org. And you will get, if you want to give me your address or if you are involved, you will get also the press release you can use and have it done and put out tomorrow or by Friday at every time you need and you want to do it. I'm finishing. The World Bank has a hidden agenda. They are not doing what they should do. And that's the reason why we need to make it public. We need to blame and to shame the World Bank. And behind them, the government and the executive directors, who are not doing their work to protect the people against climate change and against everything else what's threatening their life. That's the reason why we need a really good World Bank Action Day starting by tomorrow with your help, with your support. And thanks again to Big Shift and all the people here on the panel who gave their examples to show that it's high time that the World Bank has to do differently in regarding fossil fuels. We need renewables. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ute. And it's great, you know, after hearing a lot of the harms that the World Bank has done, to end on that positive note that we are not giving up. We're going to keep fighting to shift the way that it finances. We have 2 minutes left. And so I just wanted to open it up. If anybody has a burning question for one of the panelists, now is your chance. We have just 2 minutes, but I think that's enough time in case folks have a burning question. Okay, I think I see a hand here from Frederick Collins. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I want to direct this question to, I think it's Anne Sangole of Access Coalition. She said that the idea was to get the bank to disclose guiding principles to give stakeholders an idea of what is priority. That I think was what Anne of Access Coalition said. But someone before that said, I think with the person from South Africa, I'm not sure, look at the World Bank Energy Strategy. It was supposed to be out last year, the answer to Africa's energy challenges. And then the person went on to say World Bank preferred to develop what they called Guide to Investing in Africa. So in one part, if it was South Africa, the speaker said that World Bank preferred to develop a guide to investing, but the other speaker, Anne, said that they want the World Bank to develop, to give an idea of what is priority, like a guide. So could you clarify the apparent conflict? Thanks.
Thank you, Frederick. Anne or Katrina, do you want to help clarify?
So thank you so much. Just to mention that the issue was that, yes, indeed, we were waiting for the Africa Energy Strategy. And the bank had promised to release this strategy, but then they changed and they said that, and we don't have any, we don't have any sway over that, because they said they would now develop the guiding principles. Perhaps it's different for Katrina at local level, but at that level of the Africa Energy Strategy, that was the bank's input and guidance when Access and partners had a meeting with them. Yeah, so I'll hand this over to Katrina.
Hi, Frederick. Sorry, I'm not quite sure I follow, because I don't think I mentioned anything about the guiding principles. Maybe you could just quickly clarify your question regarding South Africa?
Let me see. If I can, let me see who said, what said that? Person who spoke actually mentioned that they were the bank. In fact, I was reading directly from my notes. The person said, let's look at the World Bank Energy Strategy. It was supposed to be out last year. The answer to Africa's energy challenges. Again, my notes are kind of sketchy, but that's, I was typing very fast. And they said the World Bank preferred to develop what they called Guide to Investing in Africa. That's what I captured from what the person said. And I think it was while the person was speaking on South Africa. But then Ms. Sangole said that they wanted, they preferred this guide. So I wasn't quite clear whether it was two totally different situations. I know it's the same World Bank, and whether one had actually delivered a guide, but not in the other, or what was the difference? I wanted a reconciliation of my understanding. I hope I'm clear enough.
Thanks. I think all of that came from Anne's presentation, and my understanding was that the World Bank had promised and then did essentially on the guiding principle. But Anne has maybe clarified. Sorry, I don't think that was part of my presentation. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
Thank you, Frederick and Katrina and Anne. And Frederick, we'd be happy to connect you to Anne and Jacqueline at Access Coalition, who can give you more details about what the World Bank recently told them around what we thought was going to be the Africa energy strategy. So, technically we are over time. We had scheduled 1 hour for this panel. But if folks, have a couple of more minutes and want to stay on and we have any other burning questions, we could take them. If not, we're also happy to follow up with everyone over email. So if there are particular panelists that you want to follow up with, perhaps the panelists would be comfortable sharing their emails and any materials, and we can follow up that way. So with that, thank you so much again to the panelists and to the participants as well for your questions and for your engagement. I think everyone has spoken already incredibly. And so I'll just close with the words, we are facing a one-time historic opportunity to fight climate change before it reaches irreversible tipping points, more communities get treated like sacrifice zones, and before billions in assets get stranded and countries sink even further into unsustainable debt. So we really, even from just this 1 hour webinar, it's evident that there's such a wealth of knowledge and perspectives and expertise and recommendations. If only the World Bank would listen to us more. So as Uta said, I hope to see everyone tomorrow, whether in person, virtually, tomorrow and Friday, as we join the World Bank Global Day of Action to put forth those demands that we heard and make them listen to us. So thank you so much again to everyone for your participation and to the panelists for your excellent remarks and presentations. Thank you, everyone.